Welcome everyone to the Sunday Staff Debrief, where every week we chat about various diving topics. I'm your host Nicole, and as always, joined by our panel, Josiah and Rich. And this week, our special guest is a former Royal Navy mine clearance diver and just became a PADI scuba instructor, Elliot Pendrous. Welcome, Elliot.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here this evening. Now, here at UDC, we are a recreational dive center. So our main focus is recreational diving. However, within the scuba diving world, there are many specialized areas, such as maritime archaeology, commercial diving, entertainment diving, and military diving, just like Elliot here. So Elliot, tell us a little bit about your history and how did you get into such a specialized field of diving?
So when I was 12, I decided that I wanted to get into diving, seeing it on the TV, seeing documentaries. I really wanted to learn how to dive and immerse myself in that environment. So I spent a lot of my teenage years diving and I wanted to make it into a career after that. I was thinking about going into doing underwater photography, and after speaking to two people in the industry, I decided that I needed a bit more experience in the actual diving sector. So I was advised to either go commercial, military, or what you were saying before, like research diving. So what I did is I applied for the military at 19, and I went direct entry as a Royal Navy clearance diver, and passed all the selective processes and managed to get in.
Very cool. So you just bypassed university altogether?
Yeah. So instead of all my mates went on to go to university, and I decided to join the Navy instead and actually go and get a career instead of go and study something. It was a bit of an unnerving time because I wasn't sure whether that was the right decision, but I soon learnt that there's a lot more out there to actually learn in the diving sector, and that interests me because that meant that I could learn a lot more.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So speaking about the apprehension towards our futures, Juicy, I know you had a construction background, and because of that, you were very interested in commercial diving to begin with. Tell us a little bit about that experience and your thought process behind that.
Yeah, so being in a construction background, I obviously thought about commercial diving as a pathway for me in this industry. I had loved recreational scuba diving, and I thought about going to school to become an underwater welder or something like that, where you make loads of money. That was definitely a draw for me at the time, seeing what the paychecks were like for these types of divers. And ultimately, I looked at the two career paths. A guy that worked at the construction company that I worked for had been a commercial diver previously. He said, it's cold, dark, and dangerous. Go to the Caribbean where there's umbrellas in your drinks and everyone's having fun and it's clear and warm, and do that recreational side of things. So I heeded his advice. But there was definitely a time when I was thinking about taking a different path in this industry and doing the commercial side of things, but ultimately made the right choice, I believe. Here I am now.
Absolutely. So Elliot, if you had to go back in time and do it again, would you have made the same decision to join the Navy?
Definitely. I think I'm more of a kinetic learner, so I learn by doing things all the time. And I think sitting in the classroom, being told things, I was kind of bored of that. But that's the way I learn. And I kind of really enjoyed getting immersed into actually doing a diving role in a practical aspect outside of the recreational environment, where we had to always have a job to achieve. So it meant that I could actually use a skill which I was being taught practically and then go and achieve an objective. And for me, that's a lot better way of learning. And then afterwards, I found that I was in a career, and a lot of my friends were leaving university with a lot of theoretical knowledge of things, but not a lot of practical knowledge. And I was quite beneficial in the fact that I got to travel around the world, and I also got to learn skills and people skills and working with people of all different nations, and I wouldn't give that up for the world, and also the teams that I was working with, the guys that I was working with were really good people, and it's different, but I'd definitely do it again.
So Rich, you have an engineering and construction background. Yep. How was the transition from that into a career in scuba diving?
It's a complete different change from a 9-to-5 job where you're expected to produce results and there's deadlines and stuff like that. And then you go into another career when it's completely different. We don't have weekends, we don't necessarily have a defined schedule. The only result we have to produce is finish the course with people nice and safe and with a smile on their face. That said, I think there are similarities between all careers. There's a certain amount of work ethic and dealing with the day-to-day business that you do. All of those things connect. So having a previous career, I know Juicy's the same, put me, I think, in a better stead to become a better instructor than I was or would have done if I'd have gone straight out of school. I wouldn't have been ready to take on the amount of work that we have to do and the role that we have to fulfill.
So what everyone really wants to know, what is the deal with the bombs and what was your role specifically?
So as a mine clearance diver, our primary role was getting rid of legacy ordnance from primarily World War II. So, you know, the big sea mines you have of Finding Nemo, the ones that are like...
With the spikes on it?
The spikes on it. So it's that, but there's many variations of them, but that's the easiest way of people having a relatable thing that they can think about. So what our job would be to find them, and then use certain techniques to remove them out of the water, whether that was remove them from the situation they're in or make them function in the location which they're in. We also had a lot of other roles alongside that, so we used the skills which we were trained to do that job and apply it in different areas. So that was like search and recovery, underwater engineering. There's some teams to do like counter-terrorism operations. The skills which you use in that industry are very transferable to loads of different sectors, which makes a bit of a jack of all trades when it comes to being underwater. So they mostly, when we're working on ships, for example, we're trying to find mines in the sea. So when we find them, a team of us will go out and deal with it accordingly.
So how do you find those bombs in the first place?
It varies. So if we're working on a ship, I was on a ship for 3 years, and our responsibility was to scan the seabed with the sonar, pick up imaging, and then we use various different techniques such as underwater ROVs to go and inspect them. And then we would dive down, we would identify it, and we're trained during our training to know the origin of where the explosive has come from, the size of it, recognise the shape, and then we will take that information to the surface, and as specialists we'll all discuss it as a team, the same way as like when you were doing your deep diving, everyone sits around the table and you all discuss what we've seen and then how to deal with it accordingly, whether it's best to move it or whether it's best to demolish it in situ. And then from there we will then action a plan, make a dive plan, and then we will go down, and majority of the time it involves, it's always solo diving ops, it's never diving as a team, because it's more inherent risk when there's two people doing that job. But on the surface you've always got a surface crew that's working with you at all times, and they're always looking after your safety, so you can remove the task loading, the same as what we've discussed previously about task loading. If you can remove the tasks, so the team will take most of the tasks of the diving, such as the profile and the time you have to be in the water, you can focus on going down on that piece of ordnance. When we go up to it, a lot of the time we know where to place a small controlled explosive, so we'll place that onto it and we'll remove ourselves out of the water, distance ourselves away and make sure everything's safe, and in a controlled manner we will remove that explosive from that area.
So just how dangerous was your job?
So everyone asks that, and the same as like when I met my partner, she asks exactly the same, but everything's dangerous if you don't know what you're doing. If you don't know what you're doing, if you didn't know how to drive a car and you drove it down the motorway or the highway, if you drove down, that's really dangerous. But if you've been driving for 50 years and you drive down the highway, it's not dangerous at all. If you follow procedures and you know what you're doing, it's not as dangerous as everyone makes it out to be. A lot of the time we're dealing with things that have been down there since the start of World War II, so it's legacy. It doesn't mean that it's not completely safe, but it does mean that you have to treat it with some respect. in the fact that you know it's been down there for a while, but you can't then just write it off and think, well, it's been down there long enough, it's not going to function. We always treat everything with respect, and we always follow a plan, which is something that's helped me crossing over when I've done my PADI instructors, is always diving with a plan and executing the plan, because if anyone deviates from a plan, that's when it becomes dangerous. But that's the same with any dive. You deviate from a plan and then you then become it unsafe. So it's not actually the job you're going to do that's unsafe, you're making it unsafe. So it is very strict, but it's strict for a reason, and we all stay safe.
So you don't really even know if these bombs are active or not?
So,
or is there a way to tell?
The best approach, which we would always assume it was active and deal with it accordingly. So when you go through your training at the very start of your career, they bring you up through a system by teaching you all of the different equipment which you're going to use, because we use various different equipment. And then from there, they then build on that knowledge, and then they say, right, now you know that equipment, this is how you're going to use that equipment. And then from there, they will teach you about the explosives and take the equipment, take the knowledge that you've learned about the explosives and bring them together. So then you're just doing it underwater then. So the idea is to remove the water out of the way and make that your working office. And then you can just focus on the explosive. So when we go down to the school, we'll be able to identify its characteristics, its size, where it's from, its lengths and measurements. So for example, we know every single part of our body's measurement, because we don't take down tape measures, so we know, for example, the distance between there to there and there to there, and arm spans. So when we come up, we can memorize all those numbers and recreate it on a board or on a piece of paper. Then we can give that to the team, and the team can discuss that. And then we will be like, well, if that part is missing, for example, it's not going to be a threat. So there's no point demolishing it in situ, where it might affect, for example, like shipping or maritime operations, because we know it's safe. So we could lift that and move it. But for example, if we see a part and we know that that's damaged and we know what that part does, then we can be like, well, that's probably not a very stable situation. We need to deal with where it is.
Wow. All of this teamwork and planning and details, it sounds a lot like the stuff you guys do in tech diving, right?
I mean, a little bit, yeah, in terms of the planning and all that sort of aspect, the teamwork, but nothing to do with the bombs. We don't tend to do that sort of stuff. You've said once or twice function. What you mean is blow that mother up.
Yeah, pretty much.
All right, so we all want to know is, what's the biggest explosion you've seen?
So during World War II, they dropped 1,000-pound bombs, which is what they dropped during the Blitz to eradicate places. And a lot of the times they either missed their target, or they were dropped on coastal areas, because that's where the Navy was based. And sometimes we find 1,000-pounders on the beach, and they're enough to level a block of flats. So when they're in quite shallow water, they're quite impressive. You can go on YouTube and see a lot of videos, and I've also got a few videos. And also when we go on training exercises as well, we do training exercises on our on army bases, and we will take modern day munitions, and we'll take it out in the field, and we will put it in like a position which we would normally find it, because we can also do land-based EOD work. So a lot of the time it will roll up onto the beaches, and then someone will be walking their dog and they'll find it, they'll call the police, and the police will then call us, and then we will turn up to the site. So we kind of recreate that in the field, and they're normally quite big because they are modern munitions that are meant to function, and they're not old, and they make quite a good, if Tropic Thunder comes to mind. Yeah.
How prevalent are these bombs? Like, how often, what is the chances that one will wash up on the beach somewhere?
So around the UK, so we do a sea time where we're like younger divers, so the equivalent of like PADI DMs, you're learning your trade. And then once you've done that, you go off to your different teams and they specialise in different areas. So like we were saying before, you've got, so some of them will be doing like counter-terrorism, some will be doing very shallow water mines. And the team I was at before, we were specialised in nuclear submarine underwater engineering and helping that sector. But when we weren't doing that, we worked military aid to civil authorities. So the police would, like we were saying before, the police would call us, and then we would turn up. So on a weekly basis, so you'd be duty from like Monday to Sunday. And they would call you, and I think sometimes on average about 3 times a week you'd be called to an area to go and get rid of munitions. Sometimes it was nothing, sometimes it might have been a small grenade from an exercise, and then sometimes it's like a sea mine that's just rolled straight up on the beach. So it can vary a lot, but they do happen more than you'd think, but they don't make it onto mainstream media as much because it happens so much, and it's in remote areas a lot of the time. So our operating area was from Liverpool in the UK across the whole, everything north. Big up for the Liverpool.
Go Reds.
And we covered all the coastline of there, so the inner and outer Hebrides and the Shetlands and the Orkneys. Most people in the UK have never been to these places, so it doesn't really affect them, so it doesn't make the media as much, but it does happen more often than you'd think.
So in my mind, and maybe you should tell us differently, that you guys find a bomb, you swim up to it and you put something on it, you swim away, go back to your boat, drive off, and like a bunch of yahoos just go bop and watch it explode.
So there's multiple different ways in which we would like execute that. There's many different ways of achieving the same objective. If you're on land, it's very easy to obviously run something back and press a button, which is when like I was saying, when we work in the police, that's most of the time what you do because it's very controlled. You can stop the whole exercise at that point. When it's happening, if someone was to walk in the way or something was to happen, you can stop it. But when you're in the water, obviously you haven't got the advantage of being able to run a cable straight down to it. So a lot of the time we'd place the charge, we'd come to the surface and we'd set a timed fuse, which sounds very archaic. It's very much like Roadrunner with a whole time fuse, but it's a very regimented procedure which we do. We know how long it will take.
So if you got a cramp and you couldn't swim fast enough, you'd be in a spot of bother.
So you don't start it when you're swimming back away. You start it, so we get on the surface and then we'd make sure everything was clear, the whole area was clear because we clear the whole area, and then we'd start the timer, we'd remove ourselves from the situation and then watch it function, or as you said earlier,
blow up.
Yeah. So that was the way we do it, and that's the preferred way of doing it. It's a very controlled way, but you always haven't got the luxury of having that available to you. So we have different ways of achieving the same goal.
So do they have any idea how many of these bombs are in the ocean?
So I should really know the
There
statistic.
must be a lot, right? If it's a job.
Yeah, so there's a lot. There is a lot. I'd be lying if I said a statistic now. But the proportion is a lot higher. We're still going to be finding them for a long time to come, because the problem is so during World War II, everyone countermined each other. So they put mines in, we put mines in, another country put mines in. So they mined against those mines, and we mined against those mines, and it just kind of piled on top of each other. There is a lot of features of these mines that meant they had to be deactivated after a certain amount of time and made safe. But the way they made it safe was they made a lot of the munitions go down to the bottom, fill with water and go to the bottom, because they were like, well, that's immediately safe, it's fine. And now we're finding that over years and years that they're actually working their way back up because they're just like big rocks just bounding along the bottom and now washing up. And now we've got that issue. But that's why doing our job's quite satisfying when you remove a threat, because it's something that we did and now we're trying to help and undo, the same way as when we're diving. We try and help and undo.
Absolutely.
And you get to see a big fucking explosion.
That's a good benefit of it. Yeah.
So I'm curious, with the different explosives that you had to defuse in your job, what type of depth are you working at?
So our maximum operating depths, we would be using a CCR, which is specialised for us. So we have to make sure, well, the CCR we're using has a low magnetic signature, because obviously that's a way of functioning mines. So it's a specialised unit for ourselves, and we operate down to 60 metres. Because mines can be, most people think, like we were saying before about the Finding Nemo situation, most people think that they're sitting right below the surface, but they're not actually sitting right below the surface. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're even on the surface, and then sometimes they're at great depths which we can't get to ourselves, and that's when we'd use ROVs, for example. But some mines will like sit on the bottom and be listening for ships going over the top, and they have sensor packages on them that are listening for a set tone or vibration from ships coming over the top, and they know what they're looking for, and at that point they usually they will detonate, and they will cause a shockwave which will come to the surface. A shockwave is more dangerous to a ship than actually hitting it straight on, because a shockwave will bend a ship. You can imagine the tonnage that's involved with ships. If you were to lift it out of the water, it would naturally bend, and that's better than if it was to hit it directly. So a lot of the time we'll find there's some mines that are at depths that detonate and send the shockwave up and break the boat, and those are the kind of mines you'd be dealing with at depth, all the ones that have sank down to the bottom, and then you just identify them at that point.
Cool.
So you're saying it just lifts them out of the water. That makes a certain amount of sense, like, because ships are armoured at the bottom, so that if a torpedo or mine hit them, it wouldn't do much damage. But I studied a bit of naval architecture at university, and the amount of weight with all that armour, it's just going to come up and literally bend the ship and crack it through the middle. That's a more devastating way to a ship. That's incredibly interesting. That's really, really cool.
Thank you everyone for joining this week's episode of the Sunday Staff Debrief. And as always, thank you to our panel, and a very special thank you to our special guest, Elliot. And make sure you join us next week for another really interesting topic. And as always, please help us grow our channel by
Like the video.
Subscribe to the channel.
And leave a comment below.
See you all next week.